Hello everyone, and welcome back to Conspiraseed. This week we're doing part 1 of Tier 7 of the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. I'd also like to apologize for my voice if I sound a little different. I think I'm getting sick. My roommate's sick. He has like a cold or something. So if I sound a little different, that's probably why. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with me today. I really do appreciate it. And let's just get into it.
Nothing like being subscribed to Conspiraseed on YouTube. Nothing like it.
The Stolero-Yakman Chalks affair refers to a series of 3 unsolved murders that took place in Israel in the early 1960s. Between November 1962 and July of 1963, 3 murders took place in central Israel. While the victims were not connected, the cases themselves were very similar. The killer, who had no apparent motive, gunned down the victims with an Uzi submachine gun, then would immediately flee the scene. The first victim was Moshe Stolara, a 32-year-old disabled man who owned a household goods, book, and newspaper store. He lived with his parents in an apartment in the same building where his store was located. On November 15, 1962, around 7 p.m., he had closed and locked up his shop and was returning home. A gunman fired at him with an Uzi while he was in the stairwell of the building. He was hit 3 times and unfortunately killed. Nothing was stolen from his store and there was no attempt to break in, leading police to believe that the murderer's sole intention was to kill him. The second victim was Dr. Shmuel Yakman, an internal physician in Tel Aviv who provided medical services to the U.S. Embassy in Israel. He and his wife Sarah were returning home from a concert when they noticed a strange man standing on their doorstep. As they approached the man opened fire with a single shot from an Uzi, which hit Dr. Shmuel in the neck, killing him. The third and final victim is Deborah Chalks. She lived with her family in a small house near an orchard, a peaceful life. In the early morning hours, July 17, 1963, a man entered their home and fired several shots from an Uzi at her and her husband as they slept. She was killed and her husband was seriously injured. It was speculated that the murders may have been linked to Soviet involvement due to the third victim's previous visit to the Soviet Union and the second victim's service to the US Embassy. This theory falls short, however, because there's no explanation as to why the Soviets would have wanted to kill the first victim. In October of 2012, Deborah Chalks' son was interviewed by an Israeli newspaper. He claimed that his father had been active in organizing the escape of Soviet Jews who wanted to leave the country. He also said that his father continued working for Israeli intelligence after his arrival in Israel. He speculated that his mother had been followed after her visit to the Soviet Union and claimed that his father was the killer's actual target. I'm not sure if I just noticed it because I live in the Rocky Mountains or because we're here a lot, but we're back in Denver, Colorado with the Denver Strangler. There are 3 confirmed killings by them and 2 suspected killings. The first victim was Lena Tapper, a French prostitute who previously lived in Minnesota and later moved to Denver as the mistress of a Frenchman named Richard. They were both part of a secret French cult called Sorry, France, I don't know how to pronounce that. In which she played the role of a sex servant. On September 3rd, 1894, she was found strangled to death in her bed. The second victim was Marie Constant, who also was a French prostitute with ties to this weird secret order and lived with her lover, a man named Tony. On the day of her murder, Tony had fallen asleep while reading a newspaper, and on the following day, Marie was found dead in her bed, strangled to death. A small cord was so tightly drawn that it buried into her flesh with finger marks around her neck. She was a wealthier woman and only had 75 cents left on her at the time of death, leading authorities to believe that robbery was the motive for the killing. 5 men were arrested for this murder, including the first victim's love, Richard, who had made advances towards her. The third confirmed victim is a 24-year-old Japanese immigrant named Kiku Oyama. She was also a prostitute, and a few days prior to her murder, police had raided a local prostitution business and arrested several of her associates. She, along with the help of a French saloon keeper, secured their release, but the saloon keeper later demanded a monetary sum as a reward for his efforts. This made Marie angry and she argued with him about it. On the evening of November 13th, she was with her friends, but then returned home and was assumed to have fallen asleep. When her husband came home from a walk, he found her lying on the bed with a towel around her neck. She was still alive and gasping for air, so he took the towel off and ran across the street for help. Officer Carberry entered the room with him when he got there, however she had already died. There was evidence that a struggle had taken place in the room, as the bedsheets were disturbed and covered with blood. A secondary towel was on the washstand, and the killer had been through the room's drawers, most likely looking for money and valuables. There were many suspects in this case, however, none were ever confirmed or convicted. In my opinion, this person's for sure French. I mean, look at all the French connections in this case. The Kota Kihana murders refers to a series of 18 mysterious murders of women, including 3 double murders, starting in 2008, with the last murder being reported in 2015. These happened in Sri Lanka, and an arrest was made on December 11th, 2015, but his DNA only matched 6 of the victims. While the youngest victim was 19 and the oldest was 85, 15 of the 18 were over 60 years old. All the victims were women. They all took place around the same area. Many of them were before they were killed. Many of them were killed and then them and their houses were burnt down. And many of the killings showed clear evidence that they had been carried out by more than one culprit. Police then thought that not all the murders were connected, and it's possible that they were carried out by separate people. Desperuz de Lesser is the name of between 9 and 12 disappearances of children in the French division of Lesser between 1983 and 1996. Some children were murdered, one was attacked but survived, and others have never been found. 3 of these cases have been solved, but the rest remain unsolved. In the spring of 2008, the French authorities created a unit called Mineurs 38, which translates to Minors 38, with 38 being the French departmental code for Lesser. This unit consisted of several investigators tasked with re-examining all the cases. The Lewis-Clark Valley murders refers to a cluster of unsolved murders and disappearances that occurred in the Lewiston-Clarkston metro area of northern Idaho between 1979 and 1982. Authorities have identified 4 victims, with a possible 5th connected to a single suspect. The first victim is Christina White, who was 12 and was last seen on April 28, 1979 at the county fair. She called her mom around 2:30 p.m. from a friend's house asking to pick her up, as she was feeling unwell from the heat. Now, I've had heat stroke, and it is just the worst. You're hot and sweaty, but then you also have the chills and you're nauseous. I personally hate being nauseous. Like, I know I would assume no one likes being nauseous, but it is like my least favorite. Like, if I could make a deal to break a leg or an arm once a year and never be nauseous again, I would take that in a heartbeat. Anyway, her mom was unable to pick her up as she didn't own a car, and advised her just to rest, lay down, and apply a moist towel to her neck, then when she felt better to walk home. Her mom later assumed that she'd gotten better and returned to the fair because she didn't call her back. When her classmates last saw her, she was reportedly on her way home. Her schoolwork was discovered in pieces at a field outside of a city a few weeks after she vanished. She was last seen riding her bike, but neither her nor her bike have ever been found. The second victim is Kristen David, a senior at the University of Idaho. She was 22 at the time and was also last seen on her bike while traveling from Moscow, Idaho to Lewiston, Idaho. Her dismembered remains were found on July 4th, 6 miles west of Clarkston, Washington. The following day, some of the bones were discovered down the river. The body parts were wrapped in pages from several local newspaper editions from April of 1981, and the remains were hidden inside black plastic bags. Her clothes, personal belongings, and her bike have never been found. Christina Nelson and Jacqueline Miller are victims 3 and 4. They disappeared while walking from Christina's apartment to a grocery store in Lewiston, Idaho on September 12, 1982. On the same night, a possible 5th victim, Steve Persall, also went missing from the Lewiston Civic Theater. He was a custodian at the theater and asked his friend to drop him off there so he could do some laundry and practice his clarinet. He has not been seen or heard from since. He had a big brother type relationship with the 2 missing girls. The girls would have had to have passed the theater on their way to the store, so it's possible that they stopped in to say hi to Steven. The remains of Christina and Jacqueline were found on March 19, 1984 in a rural area 35 miles from Lewiston. Investigators initially suspected Stephen may have been involved in the two girls' abduction and murders, but later stated that all three had probably been in or near the theater at the time they vanished, and they were all likely victims of the same killer. Authorities believe that Stephen saw the murders and was killed as a result. The Lisbon Ripper was an unidentified serial killer who killed 3 prostitutes in Lisbon, Portugal between 1992 and 1993. The first victim was 22-year-old Maria Valentina. She was found on July 31st, 1992, in a large cabin, laying in a pool of her own blood. She had been strangled, disemboweled, and some of her internal organs had been removed. The second victim was 24-year-old Maria Fernanda. She was found January 27th, 1993, also in a cabin, and she was also disemboweled and had internal organs removed. The third and final victim was 27-year-old Maria Joao. She was found on March 15th, 1993, near the location of the first victim, of whom she was a friend. Like the previous victims, she had been disemboweled, but this time all of her organs were removed. The police made a profile on the Ripper, saying he was probably a solitary man, unrelated to his victims, and most likely a person that they wouldn't expect. They also said his crimes could be considered perfect, as there were no clues to any potential culprit. The Hamburg Rebel murderer is the name of an unidentified German serial killer allegedly responsible for the murders in Hamburg during early 1947. In total, 4 victims were found. On January 20th, 1947, in a deserted factory lot, the body of a young woman between the ages of 18 and 20 were found by children who were playing. A millimeter-wide mark on her neck indicated that she had been strangled with a string. On January 25th, 1947, the body of a nude man between the ages of 65 and 70 was found by scrap collectors. On February 1st, 1947, in the elevator shaft of a bombed-out house of a former mattress factory, the strangled body of a 6-year-old naked girl was found. On February 12, 1947, the final victim's body was located, a woman between 30 and 35, naked, and also strangled to death. The identities of the victims were never discovered. All victims were robbed, stripped nude, and strangled. There were never any signs of a struggle for any of these deaths. The Toronto hospital baby deaths were a series of suspicious deaths that occurred in the cardiac ward of the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Canada, between July 1980 and March 1981. There was a several-fold increase in mortality noticed on June 30th, 1980. Within 2 months, 20 patient deaths led to a group of nurses approaching the unit's cardiologists, but they kept the investigation limited and in-house to prevent a morale problem. The excess deaths continued, but it was not until March 1981 that a very upset father's extreme distress led to the coroner being brought in and detecting suspiciously high levels of a medication called digoxin. It's a heart regulation medication within his dead baby. The coroner, Dr. Paul Tepperman, said that he was first called to the hospital on March 12, 1981, because Kevin Garnett, a father, was unusually upset over the death of his 3-week-old son. I don't think there's any upset that is unusually upset if your child dies. It was only on March 20th, 1981, 8 days later, that he was told about an autopsy in January on a baby who also had high levels of digoxin. 8 days after that, he was told that an autopsy by the hospital had found 13 times the normal concentration of digoxin in another deceased baby. The medication had not been subject to any security measures at the time. Police were called in and began to search staff lockers when another baby died from digoxin poisoning on March 22, 1981. In January of 1982, babies became ill in a separate department. It was later found that non-fatal, unauthorized digoxin was administered on other babies, and another death was caused by an unauthorized dose of this medication. Back to September of 1981, the team leader nurse found propanolol tablets in her food that she was eating, and another nurse found propanolol tablets in her soup, leading to further investigation about nurse poisoning. The Atlanta Lovers Lane murders were a series of unsolved shooting attacks on 3 different couples in Atlanta, Georgia during early 1977. One attack caused 2 fatalities, one resulted in 1 fatality, and the other caused injuries but no fatality. The same gun, a .38 caliber pistol, was used in all 3 shootings, which suggested that a single perpetrator was responsible for all 3 attacks. Around 1 a.m. on January 16, 1977, an out-of-control car drove full speed into an intersection and hit a street sign in Atlanta. Police were called after witnesses noticed the car occupants weren't coming out. They searched inside and found LeBrian Lovett and Veronica Hill, both nude with gunshot wounds. Both were still alive when found, and they were rushed to the hospital, where both unfortunately ended up succumbing to their wounds. It was determined that the couple had been engaged in sexual intercourse at the park when an unknown individual walked up and opened fire through the front window screen of the car. LeBrian tried to drive for help, but his injuries overtook him and caused him to lose control of the car. The second attack happened around 2 a.m. on February 12, 1977. Dennis Langston and Dietra Tatum were engaged in intercourse in a parked car when an unknown individual approached the passenger window and fired 6 shots. One of the bullets hit Dennis and another one hit Dietra. Both were still alive but seriously injured and rushed to the hospital. They both made a full recovery. They said that they did get a quick look at the shooter, but they were only able to identify him as a tall black male. On March 12, 1977, Diana Collins and her fiancé were at a local park. They had seen a movie earlier that evening and were in the park to close out the date. The couple did not see the gunman as he drew near their vehicle. He shot 6 shots into the passenger side window, killing Diana. Her fiancé was wounded in the head, but survived. After the attack, he managed to drive the car to his house, where he called for an ambulance. The chain murders of Iran were a series of murders and disappearances of certain Iranian dissidents who had been critical of the Islamic Republic system, happening between 1988 and 1998. This actually isn't unsolved. It was done by the Iranian state, so I'm not sure why it's on this list. It is kind of an interesting thing, but because it's not unsolved, maybe we'll save it for a later video, because why is it on the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg if it's not unsolved? Alright, and that is part 1 of Tier 7 of the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with me today. If you enjoyed the video, please share it with your friends, family, whoever else you think would like this kind of content. I really appreciate each and every one of you. I'll catch you in the next one.